Dear all, I think we can begin. Thank you all so much for joining us today in the fourth meeting of the Women's Major Group's SDGs and the UN Human Rights Mechanisms webinar series. Before we begin, please let me remind all of you that we have interpretation. So we have interpretation to English, Spanish, and French. So it will be very helpful if you can go to the globe at the bottom of your screen and select the language you would like to listen the meeting in. Even if you would like to listen the meeting in English, please do select English because we'll have speakers who will be speaking in Spanish. So you can listen to the English translation. As you all know, we will be continuing this series until June of this year with reference to different UN human rights mechanisms each month. And this month, we'll be looking into the interconnections between the SDGs, the International Convention on Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and the International Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers and Families. A little bit info for our panelists on the Women's Major Group. We are a global intersectional feminist collective that's spread throughout the world. And our primary mandate is to facilitate the participation of our members in their advocacy in the UN Sustainable Development processes, especially at the regional and the global levels. So without further ado, please allow me to give the floor to our Arab States organizing partner, Shaima Aly, from the Kenana Association for Sustainable Development and Women Empowerment. Shaima, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shehnaz. Thanks for the introduction and the guidance through the meeting. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, wherever you are, and welcome to our meeting. As the Women Major Group with the Sustainable Development Goals and UN Human Rights Mechanisms, from a feminist perspective, we always aim to have some specific goals. Firstly, to highlight the interplay between the Agenda 2030 and the human rights mechanisms of the United Nations in order to support and enhance the implementation of the SDGs from a feminist and a human rights-based perspective. Secondly, we have been always working to increase the knowledge and capacity of our members in order to interact with the UN human rights mechanisms and utilize the SDGs in their advocacy with these mechanisms. The third goal usually has been to introduce other rights-based organizations that are working on the intersection of gender equality and UN human rights mechanisms to our members who may also want to work on the interconnections of SDGs and the human rights. So we have been trying to build this linkage between the human rights mechanisms or reporting mechanisms and SDGs. This month, we are glad to talk about two United Nations conventions that are very much related to our work and related to the intersectional work we do on gender equality and non-discrimination. The first is the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination and the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and members of their families. And for our region, migrant workers is a very important issue because we have, for example, a region which is GCC, Gulf Cooperation Council countries, which has almost more than 50% of their population migrant workers. So it's very important for us today. We have a great panel today of speakers who will both talk about the two different mechanisms, but also their work and experiences in engaging with these mechanisms. In the second part of our meeting, we will have opportunity to discuss all together how we can utilize these two conventions and their contents, and as well as the mechanisms for our advocacy on gender equality and systemic change within all the UN Sustainable Development mechanisms. Our first speaker, which I am glad to have today, will be the esteemed member of the Committee of the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, Mrs. Tina Stavrinaki. I hope I pronounce your name well. She holds a PhD in international law from the University Panthéon-Assas, Paris 2, and her thesis is Decision Piduns in 2016 is the first in-depth study on the individual complaints procedures for violations of UN human rights treaties. Ms. Tina has worked as a legal officer with the National Human Rights Institution in Greece, the UNHCR Greece, and the Marangopoulos Foundation for Human Rights. She has an extensive experience in the practice of international organizations, and her research covers a wide range of human rights issues, such as international monitoring mechanisms, freedom of expression, data protection in criminal law, gender equality, non-discrimination, racist violence, hate speech, rights of persons with disabilities, police and human rights, as administration of justice for victims, and several aspects of social rights, including the right to a healthy environment before the European Committee of Social Rights. She is the co-founder and the coordinator until 2019 of the Racist Violence Recording Network, which is a widely recognized best practice in building synergies between human rights institutions, civil society, and national authorities in order to combat hate crimes. So I believe that she is the best or the most suitable speaker for our session today. So I would like to give her the floor and ask Madame Stavrinaki, could you kindly give us more information on how ICERD intersects with the SDGs and how feminist organizations can support their work using these two mechanisms together? So I leave the floor to you, Mrs. Stavrinaki, and thank you so much for being with us today. Over to you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for this very kind invitation and very kind also introduction. So I will try to share also my screen. Excuse me, because it takes some time. It doesn't seem okay. Sorry for this delay.
Anything we can help with?
No, it's okay. Now it will. Okay. You never know when it will ask you, to connect to, and when it will. I mean, the location, what location it will choose. So, yes. So thank you very much, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to discuss this very interesting issue. I do hope that I will help you identify how useful it is to use the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. However, it's an introductory contribution, and I will be happy to explore more. So, as you know, the convention was adopted, it's an old convention, adopted in 1965 and entered in force in 1969. It has been ratified by 182 states parties, so it's important because it covers a wide region and almost globally. So that's something to take into account. And the committee I have the honor to serve, who monitors the implementation by state parties of the convention, is the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which comprises 18 independent experts. And as you see, they all come from, there is an equitable geographical distribution. I make this comment because it's important, because it's very rich, as we have the opportunity to share experiences from all over the world. And so I think it's, it's important to understand how racial discrimination, although expressions and manifestations, finally, they have many things in common, but it's important to understand how to combat against them in every region. So the convention contains a definition of racial discrimination, which, as you may already know, includes any distinction, inclusion, exclusion, restriction, or preference based on race, color, descent, national or ethnic origin, which has the purpose or effect of nullifying the enjoyment or exercise on an equal footing of human rights and fundamental freedoms in all areas of life, in political, economic, social, cultural, or any other field of public life. So as you see, although the convention is an old convention, it was already quite wise, as it includes both direct and indirect discrimination. So not only the measures which have the purpose, so it's not about intent only, to discriminate against a specific group with the intent to discriminate against, but also measures that finally, although they do not intend, they have the effect in discriminating against a specific person in all areas of life. So as of course you know, the convention is about racial discrimination. So I mean, groups discriminated on presumed race, because race does not exist, but it still is a ground on which many discriminations take place every day: color, descent, as I said before, ethnic or national origin. However, the committee recognized already in 2009 that these grounds of discrimination are extended in practice by the notion of intersectionality that I'm sure you are all very familiar with. So the fact that victims may be, subjected to multiple discrimination on grounds of gender or religion, when when you have new forms of discrimination and grounds which intersect in a way, finally, that reliance on one ground would reduce only the impact. So that's my, initial a comment on how to use racial discrimination convention on women's issue. Since you know very well that we have these intersecting forms of discrimination, where if you don't put the emphasis on both grounds of discrimination, finally we would neglect, or we would ignore one aspect of the discrimination, which I suppose that would finally leave the case of discrimination not effectively addressed. So that's something that has been built by the committee, and the committee constantly continues to examine these cases of intersectionality in all within its mandate. So the convention contains, it's a convention a little bit like the CEDAW Convention, so it prohibits discrimination in all areas. So it provides guarantees against the discrimination in the freedom of movement, in political rights, in the enjoyment of political rights, in the enjoyment of economic, social, and cultural rights, so the right to work, social security, trade unions, housing, healthcare, education, or cultural rights. It also provides for equality in access to justice and equal treatment before courts. It protects from bias-motivated violence, and the right to security of person against, bias-motivated crimes or any other kind of violence. And it also includes guarantees against discrimination in the enjoyment of civil rights. So, the right to nationality, marriage, property, inheritance, and association. What is tricky here, and it's important to understand, is that it's important to see how to substantiate not how the discrimination takes place. So that's difficult in some cases, because some cases you need, groups think that they need to compare, although to another group, to prove that they are subjected to discrimination, although we know that in some cases, only, the belonging to one group, as we all know as women at least, we have certain, barriers in the enjoyment of rights. So in states have very specific obligations under the convention. They have to abstain from acts of racial discrimination themselves. The authorities, public authorities, they have to abstain, and they have to abstain from any support or defense on such acts. They have to review regularly their policies and their laws, and amend these laws and regulations and practices in order exactly to avoid that these policies create or have the effect of perpetuating racial discrimination. So racial discrimination also should be prohibited in law. So they have to, have to establish a specific legal framework. And also they have to encourage, it's a convention that promotes, these integrationist multiracial organizations, and prohibits the organizations which promote segregations. And so the convention also provides, under the convention, states have undertaken obligations to combat anything which tends to strengthen racial division. So this is a very general introduction in the convention. And I will try now to be more, to present the concrete links between the SDGs and racial discrimination against women. So that what we have seen, and in examining reports by ICERD, or by examining states, or in cases of in cases of racial discrimination, we see that racial discrimination constitutes a motivation for disparities, for inequalities suffered by women, but also sometimes an aggravating factor. So not only women belonging to minorities or of African descent or indigenous are subjected to these discriminations because due to their presumed race, descent, etc., ethnic or national origin or color, but also the fact that they are women with the presumed race, color, descent, or origin makes them suffer more. The inequality is even, more important. So that's why I think it's very important to take the racial element, as I call it, into account, and not only, the gender, because if we don't take into account the racial element, we really cannot, address effectively the discrimination that we examine. So we have seen, for instance, how poverty, we have seen in certain states that indigenous women, not only for being women, but for being indigenous women, they suffer more from poverty. We have seen how the legal or social exclusion of migrant women or women belonging to minorities, such as Roma women, they also lead to poverty. So of course, Roma men or migrant men are also suffer from many different discriminations, and they also that lead to poverty. But it's particular in certain situations we can see how the racial element affects even more women. So in general, as I said before, the convention protects against racial discrimination in economic, social, and cultural rights. So in a way, by guaranteeing or ensuring that women from minorities or of African descent or indigenous women having access to economic, social, and cultural rights in many cases, it means that they have better chances to reduce poverty. And so, but having said that, we all know that poverty, and it's not only related to in the enjoyment of economic, social, and cultural rights, but of course it's interconnected with civil rights. Because if you don't have the nationality, because the state, as you belong to a minority, does not give you equal opportunities to access to citizenship, then it becomes even more possible that you have less tools to combat against poverty. The same goes with hunger, for instance. So access to work for women in these cases is even harder than for men, or access to land. So we have seen many different situations of restrictions in the access to land for indigenous women that we know that finally will lead these women to hunger. And so by not recognizing this kind of discrimination, we cannot address effectively the SDG on hunger. I'm sure that I cannot, I will, you're already very familiar with reproductive health rights. And we all know that, for instance, in many countries, in many states, again, the same groups have less opportunities to have access to health services, or also to have access to reproductive health rights. And also we know that in many states, the treatment by health and humanitarian staff, the treatment that women like myself, which I don't belong to any minority, but I would have access to a standard treatment. We know that other women belonging to minorities or of African descent or indigenous or Roma, we know that they also have to, in some cases, meet with challenges with health and humanitarian staff, because stereotypes, as you know, this is something that we have to acknowledge. Stereotypes are everywhere. And finally, even the persons that protect, usually turn to protect our human rights. In these cases of these groups, even these persons may perpetuate stereotypes. Finally, we have seen in other states, with regard to education, that, for example, women of African descent had less chances, they didn't have equal treatment in accessing education services. And so we understand that every state has to take into account its own reality. That's why, as a committee, we always ask statistical data on the population. So if you do not know what your population and what exactly are the components of this population, you cannot have an effective policy combating discriminations. And of course, this is even more so for cases of intersectionality and multiple discriminations. So, but again, this is not the only. So that nowadays, since some time already, we have this exacerbation of hate. So these women are not, of course, left outside. Whatever their status, whatever their work, whatever they do, they're also targeted based on their race, color, descent, or national or ethnic origin. So you have the same stereotypes related to physical or cultural attributes. And that these are the stereotypes that finally define these women. The treatment that these women have by societies. And they are further excluded and marginalized due to hate speech and violence. So you see that not only stereotypes, they follow them everywhere as migrant women or women belonging to minorities, but also hate affects the society, poisons the society, and so it is even more difficult for these women to have access to rights independently from their status. So in other words, this environment not only does not fulfill, does not promote equality and also the SDGs, but rather undermines all the conditions for promoting SDGs for women's rights. And of course, you know that we have acknowledged for some time now, but it's not, it's not very easy to combat. So we have to be able to substantiate more in detail what is a structural discrimination. And we have seen that women, with belonging to minorities or, as I said, of African descent, etc., we have seen that although they are subjected to this combined effect of laws and practices. So the laws may be very, in a specific state, may be, very well drafted and addressing the issue of discrimination. But, the way this law is implemented, coupled with the stereotypes that the society has against, these groups, finally results in this structural discrimination. So we have seen in certain circumstances, certain situations, that, for example, Afro-descendants and minority women that have the same level of education with the rest of the population, they don't have access to rights. And this so it's not a question, it's not, there is no objective justification on why they cannot have access to work, although they have the same level of education and the same qualifications. And so finally, if we do not take into account this structural discrimination, we cannot design policies addressing segregations effectively. And we cannot also measure this, as I like to call it, a compounded harm affected within the community, women and girls. So we know that within the large community of women, there are some women that suffer more due, to racial discrimination. So for instance, when you have segregating housing, so you know very well that all over the world there are specific communities that finally, they live in a segregating area, in a segregated area. So when you have the segregated housing and it keeps these communities far from basic services and
excuse me, Mrs. Yes. Stavrinaki, I just would like to remind you if you can wrap up in 1 minute.
Yes, I will. Thank you. Yes. So this is okay. So then you understand that this is far more dangerous for for women. So okay, so I think that I will go. Unfortunately, I'm sorry, I didn't know exactly how much time I had at my disposal. So anyway, I think that how to promote, by combating racial discrimination and vice versa, we have, first of all, identify, based on the convention, the links and areas of urgent attention. We have to ensure that special measure affirmative action is designed with the participation of the women and by including all feminist organizations. We have to insist on collecting disaggregated data, on promoting access to justice, on designing measures of redress, and also on ensuring appropriate monitoring mechanisms. And you can see that all these instances, they are directly connected to SDGs. So I hope that you're all familiar with the procedures provided by the treaty bodies to supervise their treaty. So you know that we examine state reports, we have complaint procedures, we adopt the general recommendations, We also have an early warning and urgent action procedure in order, to receive reliable information and try to prevent or stop a discrimination that's taking place. So it's important because in these reports, you can find information on SDGs implementation, but also the data on SDGs can also support the review by ICERD. Finally, this is my last word, I think that it's important to know that all these recommendations prepared, by the committee on specific states, they are very useful to, at national level by organizations to promote SDGs. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much, Ms. Stavrinaki, and for the valuable presentation. So just some takeaways from your valuable statements. Firstly, you highlighted the history of the International Convention on the Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination, which was ratified in 1969 by 182 states. You also stated that it included the methods to combat hate speech and discrimination in each region. Of course, you highlighted the definition of racial discrimination, which was very important. And you stated that many discriminations take place every day. However, the gender lens of the convention lays upon Article 1, recommendation number 32, 2009, which denies discrimination on the basis of gender and religion. Also, you highlighted the perspectives which have to be considered in order to have what you called the civil rights, which are important in order to implement the SDGs. You stated that policy and law reforms are important obligations to avoid discrimination and have to be undertaken by the states under the convention. You also elaborated the linkage between SDGs, which emphasize on addressing disparities of even some disadvantaged groups, and the ICRD convention pillars in order to eventually to achieve the equality and eliminate poverty and other civil rights. You also highlighted the linkage between the civil rights of some minorities as Roma community in Europe, for example, and the indigenous women, and the development goals themselves, because without civil rights, as you stated, the basic rights and services, including sexual reproductive health and rights, can be even denied for some groups. And it could make it hard to achieve the SDGs. You also stated or highlighted the importance of data and population statistics in order to feed into reliable policies. You finally pinpointed that the stereotyping and structural discrimination are existing, and how this criteria influences the accessibility to the rights, services, and recognition for some groups. Also, again, you highlighted the importance, as I stated before, the availability of reliable data in order to achieve the SDGs and address any disparities. I thank you so much for the presentation and for the valuable information. That being said, and without further ado, I would like to turn to my next speaker, Mr. Taisuke Komatsu, and I wish I pronounce his name properly. He is the Under-Secretary General of the International Movement Against Discrimination and Racism. Mr. Komatsu is the UN Advocacy Coordinator, Under-Secretary General of the International Movement Against All Forms of Discrimination and Racism, and based in Geneva, Switzerland. He provides technical assistance and capacity building trainings to civil society organizations, including indigenous, minority, migrant, and other racialized groups, to effectively engage with the UN human rights mechanisms with a particular focus on the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, CRD. His work around access, the elaboration of general recommendations, and the improvement of the membership. Before joining IMAGR, he has been working at human rights non-government organizations in Japan and the United Kingdom. So my question to Mr. Taisuke, I would like to ask him, how can feminist organizations or feminist groups even use the ICERD, and how IMAGR could help these organizations in their interaction with the ICERD Convention? So this is my question to Mr. Taisuke, and over to you.
Thank you very much. And I know my name is hard to pronounce, so you're free to call me Tai. And let me also share my slide here. Yeah, I hope you can see my slide. And then, yeah, so thank you for Women's Major Group for inviting us to take part in this informal meeting. And let me begin by what our organization do. Let me show you the slide much bigger. Yes. So our work at the committee is to support the civil society participation. And then we do it in various ways. So we produce resources for civil society. We have the guide for civil society actors, as well as a template for alternative follow-up report. So the guide is shown on the screen. And we also disseminate information about how civil society can engage with the committee in upcoming opportunities, such as country reviews, follow-up assessments, and the drafting of general recommendations and the thematic discussions as well. We provide technical assistance to civil society, especially at country reviews in Geneva, by providing information on procedures, as well as committee members, so that civil society can strategically engage with the committee at the opportunity of reviews, and they can maximize the impact of the advocacy. We also provide capacity building trainings for civil society organizations, normally before country reviews, to make sure that they have the full knowledge of upcoming session and the procedure for civil society participation, and then what they should put in the report and so on. And then lastly, we also provide do advocacy to make sure that there's a civil society space protected and also strengthened at the committee. And then we do it jointly with other NGOs specialized on different treaty bodies. And then because what we also want to do is to make it less complicated for civil society organizations to approach different treaty body procedures. And actually the speakers in the previous meetings belong to the network of NGOs, which is called TVNet, NGO Network on UN Treaty Bodies. And we do joint advocacy on the treaty body as one system. So this is a very simplified overview of what we do. And I would like to quickly move on to how civil society organizations, especially feminist organizations, can use SWORD in their procedures. So I think it's better to zoom into this chart because it was a bit small. So in case some of you have not participated in the previous meetings, I would like to briefly explain the reporting procedure of the SWORD. So it is officially a 4 years reporting cycle procedure, but unfortunately, many states fail to submit reports on time, so it can take longer depending on each state. And there are different entry points for civil society organizations to engage in this procedure. So first of all, states are encouraged by the committee to consult with civil society when they are drafting a report. So you can first check whether your country has submitted a report or not. And if not, check if they're already starting the process. And then you can request for consultation with the state to make sure that the concerns or like the issues you're working on will be included in the report. And to be honest, sometimes it doesn't happen as you wish. So if that's the case, you can also include that information in your report to the committee so that the committee can follow up on that question during the country review process. And the next opportunity is let me make it smaller here, is the adoption of the list of teams. So here it says list of issues because it's a general illustration for all treaty bodies, but actually the SWORD committee doesn't have a list of issues. Instead, it has a list of themes. And what is different from list of issues is that this is a non-exhaustive list of thematic areas that committee wish to discuss with the state during the dialogue in Geneva. And then it also does not require states to send written replies in advance to the review. And the civil society can send the information to the committee to make sure that the issues you are working on are included in the list so that the committee will also ask questions during the review. And normally the deadline is 12 weeks before the review. And then this gets published 8 weeks before the review. And you don't have to worry if the issues you're working on are not included in the list. You still have a chance. As I said, it's not a it's a non-exhaustive list. So you can still raise new issues or issues the list is missing to be raised during the review in Geneva. So you can submit alternative information about the situation of racial discrimination and also the situation of women belonging to racialized groups to the committee. And then you can also, during the committee session, you can meet the committee members to deliver oral inputs to the committee. And then also informally, you can talk bilaterally with the committee to inform them about the situation. And then committee can raise the questions to the state and then draft recommendation to the state. And lastly, and maybe most importantly, civil society can and should do follow-up at the national level. And you can do follow-up activities in different ways. Sometimes you have to start by translating the concluding observations if your national language is not the UN language, and the state is supposed to translate concluding observations, but it's not always a case that they do it, or sometimes it takes time for them to do it. So it's important that the document is accessible in the national audience, by the national to the national audience in a quick and efficient manner. And then you can follow up on the recommendations for the implementation by, for example, lobbying the parliamentarians or local governments or different ministries. And then that is what examples of what you can do at the national level. But at the international level, the committee has this procedure called follow-up procedure. So they identify around 2 to 3 recommendations for the report back in 1 year. So they ask the state to report back within 1 year about the implementation of these specific recommendations. And the committee assess the report, and also civil society organizations can submit information about the implementation of these specific recommendations, and the committee can review information they have received, and they sends a letter to the state about how they consider the level of implementation. And since 2019, the committee adopted the categories to share their assessments. So satisfactory, partially satisfactory, and non satisfactory. So they clearly mention if the state has done enough to implement these recommendations. So it can be also a very useful tool for advocacy at the national level as well, and to raise awareness again about recommendations. And then I would like to, so this is a brief overview of how civil society can engage in the reporting procedure. And in the context of SDGs, I would like to also
Mr. Tai,
yes.
If you excuse me, just 2 minutes for you to wrap up.
Yes, I can do that. And in the context of the SDGs, this procedure is also quite relevant to many of you. So this is a very unique procedure of the sort. And this is to prevent and respond to the serious violence of the Convention against a specific group or specific groups. It's not the individual victims, but the victims as a group. And then it's also important to note the committee is still processing this procedure during the pandemic, so you can already start considering whether to use this procedure. And some of the key points I'd like to share here is that you don't need to exhaust domestic remedies, and then it's a public action, unlike the primarily confidential communication procedure of special procedures. And also the committee can request actions from different entities, as you can see in the slide. But mostly it's addressed to the state. So I'm not going through each of the cases or actions the committee took last year, but I would like to just show you many of the actions they took related to SDGs, such as the impact on the pandemic on the indigenous peoples or other minorities, or the impact or the how indigenous peoples or other racialized groups are affected by mega projects. So you can use this for your advocacy related to which is related to SDGs as well. So I apologize for going through these different mechanisms so quickly, but I also put resources here which also contains what I have explained, and I'm happy to share my slides with the participants. Thank you so much, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Tai, and allow me to call you Tai directly, as you stated. So, as you mentioned, the IMAGR can help in capacity building, promoting the mechanisms of reporting of the committee bodies, and also introduce non-governmental organizations to modalities in order to respond to these mechanisms. You highlighted the work of the committee through the review process in terms of responding to the questions of the civil society organizations related to the list of issues. You highlighted the informal interactions which can happen with the committee on the elimination of racial discrimination, the CERD. And I believe that eventually we can reach out to you, being members of a women major group, for advices on the procedures and other regularities related to the committee's work in order to undertake our reporting on national levels as members of the civil society community of these countries. So I thank you so much for this elaboration. Now I would like to turn to my next speaker, Ms. Monami Maulik. Ms. Monami Maulik, she has been a leader and a grassroots organizer in the fields of migrant rights, racial justice, and global justice for over 18 years. Ms. Maulik holds a master's in public administration and human rights from Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and a bachelor's degree in international development, women's studies, and South Asian studies from Cornell University. Currently, she is the civil society liaison to the UN Network on Migration, which is established by the Global Compact on Migration in 2018. Ms. Monami, I would like to ask you if you can give us a bit more information about your work and its interlinkages with the Sustainable Development Goals, especially how the network could support or supporting the civil society organizations right now in making the linkages thematically and institutionally. So I would like to ask you this question, and I leave the floor to you, Ms. Monami. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Shaima and Sehnaz, and to the colleagues on the meeting today. I'm happy to join you. And I just want to clarify that my role is with the UN Network on Migration, not necessarily with the International Organization on Migration. We are housed at IOM, but the UN Network on Migration serves the whole UN system and all of the agencies that are involved in helping implement the Global Compact for safe, regular, and orderly migration. I wanted to I'm going to make a very short presentation to introduce the participants in this meeting who may not be familiar with the GCM, the Global Compact on Migration, specifically its linkages to the SDG, its linkages to some of these other human rights mechanisms and the civil society organizing and engagement in those processes, and how that could connect, intertwine with this relatively new process on the GCM that civil society and governments and the UN is undertaking in various regions. So I wanted to just give an initial presentation, a little bit about the GCM, and then about how engagement from your organizations can take place. I will attempt to share my screen and my presentation. Can you see the screen that I'm sharing now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Terrific. So the Global Compact is a comprehensive UN framework adopted through negotiations that took place in 2018. It was adopted at the Marrakesh conference in December 2018, with some withdrawals from the compact process, including notably from the United States early on, and with some abstentions, but for the most part, with adoption in many countries. It is, of course, a non-binding agreement. It builds upon and is grounded in existing international agreements and standards. And it certainly does not replace the International Convention on Migrant Workers. And I know this webinar is really focused on ICERD and the Migrant Workers Convention. So I think my presentation is of course about the GCM, which is of course different than the Convention on Migrant Workers. It has 23 objectives. It is a state-led but whole of government society approach. And it is indeed rooted in the SDGs, specifically Sustainable Development Target 10.7 on facilitating safe, orderly, and regular migration and mobility of people within goal number 10 and reducing inequalities within and between countries. But of course, migration, as with many of the issues and aspects we're discussing, is cross-cutting across many of the aspects of the SDGs. Specifically in terms of linking to the SDG reporting framework, as I mentioned, because even the GCM process, the assessment of how the GCM is being implemented, what aspects are being implemented, what aspects are in the interests of migrants' rights or are not contributing to migrant rights. All of this itself is being developed now in terms of how to monitor and report on the GCM. And I think then the additional step that it needs to be worked on is the reporting of migration in the SDG framework, and specifically linking the reporting on the GCM with the SDG. The GCM is rooted in 10 guiding principles, which includes human rights as a key element, as well as gender responsiveness and people-centeredness and sustainable development. As you will also note, because of the quite controversial nature of the negotiation of the GCM and the issue of migration and the separate tracks that the Global Compact on Migration and the Global Compact on Refugees have taken, national sovereignty is also a guiding principle because it is a challenging issue in different places, and particularly for civil society, which has different kinds of access, different kinds of barriers, different kinds of limits to civic space and organizing in different countries on the migration question, as well as many others. The GCM has 23 objectives, as you can see here.